You're pretty old.
I am old, but my memory's
That's the problem.
my memory's not good, and I'm Irish, so I tend to embellish things. So
Well, they are good in Belgium.
no, I don't know.
I just had to be late because that's not my style.
Okay, in behalf of the Kelly House Board, it's a great pleasure to see all of you here today, and it's a special pleasure to have these two gentlemen here to talk about their dads, their outlaw dads. And we felt that this was close enough to Father's Day that they could still honor their dads a week later. So we're happy that you're here, and this is our 33rd History Talk. So we do these from March through October on the fourth Sunday, so we hope that you'll all be back for those fourth Sundays the rest of this year through October. So it is my pleasure to introduce Bill and Lance, who will entertain you with stories. And if you have any questions along the way to ask them or any comments to make, go ahead and do it, because this is a conversation with the audience kind of program, and we're very happy that they're here for this presentation.
Amen.
Thanks, Steve. Well, Lance, nice to see you.
Good to see you too, Bill.
It seems like Lance and I'll run into each other 2-3 times in a week, and then we don't see each other for 6 months, usually at Mendocino. So.
Yeah, well, I thought it was really great. We actually didn't see each other for quite a while, but then we became reunited over the bees. And it was interesting how, Bill has always been a part of my life because of his father and my father's relationship. But Bill wasn't Bill Jr., or as I knew him most of my life, Henny. Wasn't really in the situation a lot of the time because his mother and father lived separately. So I didn't see him as often. I would see him, he'd come tooling in his Model A or something like that and be hanging around the house, but he was a little bit older than I. Not much, just slightly older, but just old enough that he was driving a car when I wasn't. So I didn't know him, but I was intimately related with his dad, and knew him as Big B. And so Bill and I knew each other, but I had a question about bees, so somebody said to call Bill, and I went over, and there was a big swarm of bees, and I wanted to catch it, but Bill was so amazing. I actually wrote this story down, and I want to give it to Bill someday, about how my son and I stopped by his house, and there was a swarm of bees, but we had no beehive because he'd already given his spare beehive to somebody else who caught a swarm. And so, but he had boards, and he had a shop. And so in a short period of time, we built a beehive, we put some frames in it, and I captured those bees. And since then, I've sort of become the bee whisperer around here, and I'm always prying bees out of people's houses, and I always have to thank Bill for that I'm catching bees. But that's how we became reacquainted, and then our kids went to school together. I mean, my kid was in his class. And so we got reacquainted later in life, and now we get to get together and tell stories and tell you guys some stories.
My mother and father divorced when 1955, I was 10, and so I didn't have a lot of contact with my dad until I was 10 at the time. So when I was 20, after high school, we reestablished a really great relationship and remained really good friends up until his death. But I don't, because I was sort of out of the picture for those 10 years, I don't remember a lot about your dad either. But I guess I could tell a story now. The one story that really sticks in my mind about your dad is, and this is pre-1955, it's when you guys lived up there behind the Golden Rule on Laurel Street.
Right.
We went through that little walkway to get back to your place there. It was wintertime, it was crab season, and your dad and my dad had gone crabbing. And there's a big pot going out there in the porch, and they were sitting in the kitchen table. They both had white t-shirts on and drinking red wine, and cooking the crabs. And we were just little kids. My dad always called your dad Buck.
Right.
Yeah, so he was Buck. They keep the two bills separate. And I always will remember your dad. They were sitting at the kitchen table, hot in there, steamy, and across the kitchen on the wall there was a fly. And your dad, Buck, goes, "Watch this, Bill." And he reached down, he had it on a little stand or somewhere alongside of his chair. He picked up, and it was a blowgun that he'd made. And he stuck that fly right to the wall. I was about 8 years old, and oh God. And he did it. I mean, Jesus.
Yes.
I don't know if it was a one shot. He didn't shoot again, put it down, and that was the end of that.
Well, that was that was a capacity of his. If he got extremely lucky at any given moment, he knew when to quit. So, that's the mark of somebody who really knows how to make it count. You don't want to follow up with. But the thing is that, Buck, my dad, was legendary, for being, his physical prowess and his capacity to shoot a gun. I mean, guns were a big part of his life, and I was raised on guns and ammo, literally. The first book that he wanted me to read was Field and Stream, or Guns and Ammo, and pick out a good weapon to kill your first animal with. And so I was raised with this completely different mindset than people are raised nowadays. My father, as he drove down the road, it was like going through Harvest Market. When you go to Harvest Market and you go down and you go, "Oh boy, those apples look great," or, "Oh, that's a nice looking roast." As my father drove along, he said, "Right down there in that field, Lance, there's a little swamp down there." He goes, "The best damn watercress in the whole area." He goes, "You stop there," he goes, "and when you walk down the trail," he goes, "wild blackberries." He goes, "Not Himalayas." He goes, "Real blackberries, the good kind that Ma makes a pie from." And everywhere, you can get trout here. He goes, "You could set snares for rabbits down there." He goes, "Boy, there's periwinkles and mussels over here. This is great. This is on a ride to go crabbing." But as I don't need to know every animal we can eat on the trail, Dad. But the thing is that was it. He actually carried a Bayer aspirin bottle, and it had his mixture of salt and pepper in there. He'd put salt in and put pepper in there and shake it up, and he'd keep checking it until it was just the right amount. That was in case you came across something to eat, because you don't know. I mean, there could be something to eat, and there was nothing worse than finding a perfectly good edible item and not have salt and pepper. You figured that was, you had to have that. And so you might be walking along a trail, and you'd be going, and you would just think, "Well, I'm kind of hungry. We've been walking for a long time." And he would hold out his hand, and he would go like this and just move his hand, and you could hear the eggshell crack, and he'd have hard-boiled eggs in his pocket. And as he walked along, he would roll the hard-boiled egg in his hand and flick the shell off with his thumb. And at the same time, he'd be reaching in his pocket, and he'd screw the cap off of the bottle with his thumb like this. And he would squeeze the bottom of the shell, and the egg would slowly slide up out of the bottom half, and he'd go and put salt and pepper and hold it out like that. And when you reached out and took it, you had a perfectly peeled, hard-boiled egg in your hand with just the right amount of salt and pepper on it. And he would keep walking as if that was just normal. You peeled eggs with one hand and prepared a snack while on the trail, going to catch some trout somewhere. So
I was sort of the same way as you, always raised with guns as a little kid. And boy, my recollection of guns that really burned into my mind was, this is while my mother and dad were still married. And so we were little kids. I was probably 6, my brother 5, my sister, she would have been 3. And it was during deer season, and we came in from the ranch out on the Ore Springs Road to do a little shopping. And so it was my dad, my brother, sister, and I, and we hadn't done the shopping. We whistled right in, to Stanley Street there in Ukiah, and there happened to be a saloon right across the street from the courthouse. So he pulled in. I think it was a '47 Chevy, I think we had, and that Comptia Road at that time nothing was paved. Dust was thicker than heck. We pulled in to the courthouse, parked right in front of the saloon there across the street from the courthouse. He goes, "I'll just be a minute, kids." You know, we hot in that car, and of course there was a dog in there, and windows up. And so we fiddled around, went through the glove box, and saw everything in there, and we went through the ashtray and smoked all the cigarette butts. We started looking around in the car, and we found underneath the seat a .30-30. And so we pulled that gun out, and we started just pulling the hammer back and clicking it. Pulling it back and clicking it. And one of us, I don't know if it was my brother or I, was a lever action, cocked a shell, put a shell in it. Luckily the gun was pointed down, and I think it was my sister that pulled the trigger. And when that gun went off, that car, because it had been over the Ore Springs Road so many times, was just this cloud of dust. And we couldn't see anything. Just this explosion in the car. And the first thing we saw was my dad flying out of that saloon. He jumped in the car, and we flew out of town and back over the Ore Springs Road. And we thought, oh man, we're going to get it. You know, and all he said was, "Don't tell your mother." And we didn't. She never did know about that.
Yes, well, I mean, leaving your children in the car while going in for a snort, you know, was a pretty common procedure back in those days. I mean, we went in and the bartenders used to make you a Roy Rogers or a Shirley Temple, and then the phone would ring, and it would be your mother wondering where your father was and where you were, you know, and it was always
Just left.
and it was out of there. But one of the great things, Bill's stepbrother, John Severicos, I consider him my best friend. We've been hanging out together since we were 5 years old. So we used to spend quite a bit of time with Big B and Buck, and we would go out on adventures with them all the time. And one of the great adventures that we did was, we never knew what we were doing. It was just like, get in a truck. You know, I mean, you didn't know. Get in the truck, it could mean anything. You know, it was like you could be going to the dumps, you could go have to visit some old relative for a while. You didn't know what it was, but it was like getting the truck. So, but one day, Buck and Big B were pretty busy. They were in and out of the garage loading stuff into the blue pickup truck, and they were really, you know, and then I saw a gallon of wine came out of the house and got stowed in the truck, and I knew that it was, you know, a fair to middling adventure, you know. Then it was like, get in the truck, and we got in the truck, rode in the back with all the gear. We had the chainsaw, and boy, there were wide belts and ropes and all kinds of stuff. And then we drove down to where the Circle K is now. But back in those days, it was Heitmeyer's Motor Court. And it was, there's a couple of motels still like it here in the area. But it was cabins that were separated by breezeways. It was a real family-oriented place. The Heitmeyers ran it. Their house was right there. There were 2 complete fish cleaning sinks. And this great thing, everybody there, you could leave your boat there and come back in a couple of weeks. And it was a fishing motel. And so you would always go in there and people would be cleaning their fish or abalone or whatever. And B and Buck were friends of the Heitmeyers, and they had the largest bull pine tree I've ever seen in my life growing in the middle of the motor court. It was gigantic, and it grew right in the center of it, and it had a little white rock partition around the outside of it and some grass there and everything. But the tree had lived its life, and it was time for that tree to come down. And so we went there, and these 2 guys prepared to take that tree down. So of course, the first thing was to examine the tree and to walk around it quite a few times, having several snorts out of the bottle. You know, just to size it up and to see what they'd really got themselves into, because of course, the reason they were taking the tree down, I'm sure is that late at night, probably in a dark place in Fort Bragg, somebody said, yeah, boy, we need to get that tree down, and a voice said, we'll take it down for you for $50 or $25, and so that's why they were down there. But now they were sizing it up. It was a pretty big job, but they decided they were going to go for it. So the pickup truck's parked partway over in the parking lot there, and my dad gets out and he backs up to the tree and he starts motioning for Brazill to bring the truck back. And so they start backing the pickup truck back, and he keeps backing it, and my dad leans back and he's like this. Right about there. And he stops the pickup truck. So then they have another pull on the bottle, and my dad turns to me and he says, you want to snort? And I said, sure. You know, you bet. You know, and so I get over there and he hands me a gallon of In Rosé. You know, now I've seen how this is done. If you're a real professional at it, you just stick your finger through the loop and you throw it up on your shoulder like this, and then you get it like this, and and it just runs right in the side of your mouth, and you can almost talk and smoke a cigarette while drinking like that. If you're a real professional. My dad was good at that. He's like a ventriloquist who could drink water and speak at the same time. But anyway, so I get a hold of the bottle, and I get it up, and I take it, and I go, look. Wrong. It's like, what? Right on the back of the head. He said, I said a snort, not a chug. And so they hand the bottle to John, and he has a snort. He's smart enough right now. He knows the difference between a snort and a chug right at this point, because there's a snort, a chug, a glug, and a chug-a-lug. And all of these different things are different, and you know, there's a very definitive point in between any of them. You know, you have to be careful, especially with somebody else's bottle. You know, if it's your bottle, you can have whatever you want, and then demand that they only have what you want them to have. Good, good, good. Have a snort. But, so we, you know, a couple of hits off of that bottle, and we were kind of lit. Now the guys just climb up the tree and they head up and they just basically disappear out of sight. My neck was getting sore looking up the tree watching. And suddenly, a gigantic chunk of bullpine hits the earth. At least, oh, it missed the truck by 18 inches. And they commenced to saw the whole tree down until it was just a pile of chunks. And about every 5-6 minutes, one of them would lean out of the tree at an absurd angle and yell down, "Get the hell out of there! Get away from the truck!" You know, and then they would saw another piece down, and that's what we did for the afternoon. The only time they came down is when they got really thirsty. And then my dad told me, and if I tell you to tie that jug up there, he showed me how to tie it on in case they got real thirsty part way up there. And so that's what we did for the afternoon, was just let them rain giant chunks of tree down around us as we darted in and out of them to see if there was anything interesting there. Nowadays, you would have been arrested immediately as soon as you started giving your children alcohol. They would have picked you up and taken you away. When you started dropping tree chunks out of the air, auto, they would have definitely taken you away.
Talking about bottles, that sort of reminds me of a story, made me think of a story about my dad and bottles. And, my dad had a lot of jobs. We'd sort of put together listeners. I'll just run off quickly the jobs that I could think of that he had while I knew him. And there were a lot of ones where he was just there momentarily, but just about every other job, you sandwich in a bartending job, or at the same time a bartending job. But he worked for the phone company. He's a lineman for about 20 years. Then he's a bartender and a commercial fisherman. He had a butcher shop at Brown's Ranch Market right on the, be the northwest corner of the Safeway parking lot now. Then he had a Pepsi distributorship, and he was a building inspector and a street sweeper and a real estate salesman, land surveyor, which turned into a really great job of counting the number of times the pile driver hit the pilings when they put the mooring basin in. And he was a truck driver, school bus driver, gardener, and there were 7 kids altogether that he was amongst that helped raise. But talking about the bottles made me think, he had this Pepsi-Cola distributorship for a few years here in the coast in the mid-1960s. And I would come home summers, or sometimes I'd take a semester off, and I generally worked with him. And we would partner up and do something on these jobs. And he had this Pepsi-Cola distributorship, and it was pretty interesting where one day a week we would drive from Fort Bragg to Walla and deliver to all the stores. One day we would go to Leggett Valley. One day would just be in the Fort Bragg area, and then one day we would drive to Yorkville. And this story is about a trip that when we went to Yorkville, and we would hit all the stores on the way down, and right where Floodgate Market is, or Floodgate, whatever, I guess it's still a market.
Yeah.
It used to be a really wonderful little store, and there was a little beer counter in there and a grocery store, and a French lady owned it, and she couldn't speak very good English. And she was a good account. She sold a lot of Pepsi-Cola for us there. And we would whistle in, and in distributing soda water here on the coast, getting a position in the back room where your product was close to the cold boxes where they filled them was crucial. Because if it was easy to stand behind the cold box and put your soda water in, it was going to sell. And so my dad had worked out a really great spot with this woman at Floodgate, and I think she liked my dad a little bit, and so we sold a lot of Pepsi there. And all of a sudden our Pepsi sales started decreasing, and we noticed what was happening. The Coke distributor had bumped our stuff out of the way and put his stuff where it was handy, right where our Pepsi stuff was. And my dad had talked to the guy, he was out of Ukiah, his name was Bart, and they really weren't the best of friends, but my dad corrected him, and we moved his stuff out of the way and put our stuff there, and we'd come back next week and the Coke stuff would be there. And that went on and on. He talked to the woman that owned the store, and it was up for us to work it out. So after a month or so, we wheeled in our Pepsi, and we'd only sold a couple cases where we'd been selling like 10, 20 cases a week. My dad goes, "Oh, I'll fix that son of a bitch." And so the Coke was right there. He left the Coke right where it was, and he reached in his pocket and he pulled out a pocket knife. And he very carefully lifted the cap off of the Coke. And he reached over in the corner, there was an upside down mop, and he cut a mop string off. Took it over and he dropped it in that bottle of Coke and put the cap back on. Next week we went in that store, and she goes, "Give to me Pepsi. I take Coke no more." We sold, she was our best flyer. Alvin, we used to deliver to Alvin. We never did that at Mendoza's.
Well, the bad boys know how to deal with it. So that's for sure. The thing is that when we first talked about this, we wanted it. The theme Outlaw had been brought up because myself, I was raised outlaw. My dad was an outlaw. That's what he called himself, and everybody knew it. And he was really, he cultivated it. I mean, to him, that was the way to be. And so, a few different things happened to me when I had my own boy that really made me think about it, is that you make choices, and what does it mean to be an outlaw? Because although a great thing was one evening a neighbor yelled over to my dad and said, "Hey Bill, you going deer hunt tonight? Last night of the season." You know, my dad was like, no way. He goes, good night to get yourself killed. He goes, every yahoo is out there. They'll shoot every bush that moves. He goes, I never would go out tonight. He goes, good night to get shot. He goes, anyway. He goes, long season starts tomorrow. So, you know, it's just like he looked at it a different way. You could hunt during the short season or you could hunt during the long season, you know, and it was just, which season did you prefer? He preferred the long season. Nobody else was out there. And it was the same thing. I mean, abalone, it was whether you could get them or not as to whether the season was open. And things like the mussel quarantine, we go out, we see that, you know, people give you these rules. You don't eat mussels unless there's an R in the month, you know, because, and it was strange because we would walk up in the summertime and we'd be walking along the truck road. He'd pick a spot where we would go look for arrowheads out in the sand dunes. And there were shell mindens all over the place where the Indians had cleaned the mussels and their abalones, and these shell piles would be all over the place. And you could often find arrowheads in the same vicinity where they had worked around there or had lost them or whatever. And he would always just stick his hand into one of these shell piles, which was nothing but mussel shells, and he would kind of let them sift through your fingers. And he said, they only ate these during June and July and August. He goes, that's when they were on the coast. He goes, as soon as it got cold and started to rain here, he goes, they set the woods on fire and went back home. He goes, so it's absolutely crazy not to eat mussels during the summertime. He goes, and anybody knows when the red tide is in. He goes, the ocean stinks and the fish are floating belly up. He goes, and so who's going to eat anything out of the ocean, you know, when there's poisonous plankton in the water? So we would, you know, go out there and he would point out these facts. So a season, whether it was official or not, didn't matter. He hunted a different type of deer at a different season of the year all the time. When the does were carrying fawns, he'd kill a barren doe. And he'd say, you know, that's what you do. He goes, when your cows don't produce anymore. And he goes, really? He goes, what does the farmer do? He goes, you cycle it on, it goes on. He used to shoot a cowhorn spike at a certain time of the year because whether their belief was true or not, they believed that cowhorn spikes were sterile. And so it didn't really add to the gene pool at all, and it was great eating. You know, he prized a cowhorn spike above all other deer for eating. But he, you know, he was a conservationist, even though he paid no attention whatsoever to whether it was a season. He was using great conservation techniques the entire time that he was doing it. He would never overhunt an area. He would never decimate a population of animals or marine life or anything like that, because his whole thing was sustainable. He wanted me to be able to do it. And so it was a great juxtaposition. Here was a guy who was a total outlaw. He operated outside of the law. He killed more deer with a .22 probably than any person who's ever lived in Mendocino County, that's for sure. And when I was a kid, I remember we used to always have a deer hanging in the woodshed at 625 Laurel Street. And it was like, you know, don't let anybody know. But I remember one day going out, being really young, and my dad went out, and we went into the woodshed there, and he had his razor-sharp boning knife with him, and he parted a ham off of a yearling that he had killed earlier in the week. And he had a piece of sheet, nice clean sheet, and he took that ham and he wiped the whole thing down with vinegar and water, and then he wrapped it in that piece of sheet. And he threw it in the front seat of the car and said, get in. And we got in, and we took a ride downtown, and we went to a little alley house in Fort Bragg, and he grabbed the ham and knocked on the door, and this little lady answered the door. She was really sweet, you know, and I would say, I didn't really know because I was young, but I would think that she was an older Italian woman who lived, that was the section of town that she was in. And we went inside, and the place was very spare. And my dad laid that ham on the table and everything, and we visited for a little while, and she gave me a cookie and a piece of hard candy, and she gave him a glass of wine. And we got up and we left. And when we got in the car, he said, "That's the only good meat she'll eat this month." And I didn't, you know, we ate meat all the time. But, you know, we probably ate more meat than most people. But we weren't getting it down at the Golden Rule Market. My dad was getting it out, you know, side hill salmon was a big part of our diet. And so here it was, is that he was actually providing somebody. He was providing somebody with important protein, and he was helping support her and sustain her. You know, and he was getting it out in the woods. The way that he felt about it, it was something that was there for the taking. You didn't abuse it, you used it. So there was always a big juxtaposition in the thing of being an outlaw, but was being an outlaw necessarily bad?
My dad, thinking of hunting, my dad always had a good dog. And they were always exceptional dogs. And of course, they were hunting dogs. He had a lot of other animals too. He always had chicken, had a milk cow, and there were always animals around. But he had this one dog in particular. This dog was just an amazing dog, and he named him Bud Hayes. I don't know if you remember Bud Hayes. And he got that, it was a black lab, and he got it off of a fishing boat. A guy came in, I think, from Bodega Bay, and he was mistreating the dog. My dad asked him for it, and he gave it to my dad. And that dog was the smartest dog, but it had one problem. It would stay around for months and it would disappear. And he'd have to go looking for the dog. He'd find it and he'd bring it back, and then it'd be around for a year, but it had this wandering streak in it. And during those wandering streaks, occasionally the dog catcher would catch it. And at that time, the dog pound was just out Pudding Creek Road, not too far from his house. And so the first place he'd look for the dog, if he couldn't find it, was to go to down to the dog pound. There it was. And so that Bud Hayes got picked up 2 or 3 times and went to jail. My dad would go down and cost him $5 or it was to get him out. And it was on a Friday night. Bud Hayes disappeared, and he went down to the dog pound. The dog catcher was gone, but Bud Hayes was in jail. So he came home, grabbed his gun and went back to the dog pound. And they shot every lock off of every door at the dog pound and turned every dog loose. and then, that next Monday, the dog catcher quit. And my dad, I went with him to Ukiah. He made an application. He was going to be the dog catcher. He took the test, but he didn't get the job.
Yeah, well, it's actually funny, you know, it's like, because my wife told me I should have notes for this. And so I made some, but they're senseless to me now. But right down here is, I actually wrote Murph down here. And Murph was another one of your dad's dogs.
Yeah, Murph was it?
Huh?
Yeah, I remember Murph.
Well, Murph, you know, it's like, I guess there's no kids here. Bill had taught this Murph a little trick, and every time he would start it, Toby'd get upset, and she'd say, "Bill, don't you dare," but he would always say it. Murph was one of those dogs that when Bill said Murph, Murph kind of like woke up and took a look at Bill like, let's see, chase a cat, scare away a burglar, bark at the hawks, just get the hell out of the way, you know, what was it? And he'd always say, Murph. Murph would perk up one ear and look over at him like that, and he'd say, "So Murph," he goes, "how'd all the little girls make their money?" that dog would flop over on his back and stick his feet up in the air. And Toby would just like go out of her mind every time do that. But
He liked his animals though, that darn, we built a little outlaw house out on his property. We lived out there, and Erin, our daughter, was about 10 years old, and he had a nice flock of chickens out there. And he had a rooster. His rooster name was Frank Sinatra, because he had a beautiful voice, he said. And it was one spring day out there, and Erin we just gotten a new kite, and we were flying that kite. We were out there in the field, and north wind was blowing, was flying the kite, flying it. And God, she got it up, and she was just happier than heck. She had her all by herself, and that kite kept drifting over, and it drifted over the chicken pen. And that old rooster, Frank, started letting out a crow and getting all concerned, warning his hens. Thinking it was a hawk. And that back door flew open. And my dad came out on the porch with his double-barreled shotgun, and he looked up, and thinking it was a hawk. He looked up, and he saw it was a kite, and he looked over at Erin, and then he just shot the kite anyway. But here's this little girl. And his kite just exploded, and the string just dropped. And he goes, "Erin, don't fly your kite over my chickens anymore." That kite just exploded.
Probably didn't call her Erin though.
Now it's Odie or some darn.
You had a nickname for everybody.
Yeah.
yeah,
The Bill?
Yeah.
What was Grace Burns your aunt?
She was my aunt, yeah, on my mom's side.
And her mother was her mother lived there. Would she be your great aunt, I guess?
Grace was my great
Grace,
aunt.
but Grace lived there for a while with her mother.
In Mendocino here.
Yeah.
Yeah, at the old house.
I can just barely remember that.
Huh.
That was before your time, I'm sure.
Yeah. My dad's family, it's funny because my mom and dad divorced, and I didn't see much of my dad for that, from 57 to mid-60s, and he, so my mother's side of the family, the history was really drilled into me, and it's just been the last few years I've been learning more and more about my dad and his family, and it's really, on his mom's side, they were the Stanleys, and they came to,
Now, is that the street that's named after
It is,
Stanley
yeah.
Ukiah?
They came to Ukiah in 1859 and started a hotel, and then they stayed there. Then their children, my great-grandparents, moved to Westport, and then my grandmother, my dad's mother, was born in Westport. She was a school teacher in the Westport area, and then Boonville. My dad's father, Bill, also came from Ireland, County Tipperary, and in 1906, and then he and my grandmother were married in 1920s. My dad was born in 1926 and passed away in Fort Bragg, and then passed away in Fort Bragg in 1993.
What year did he pass away?
93. But since my dad, my grandfather passed away at an early age, my dad spent his school years in Anderson Valley, because my grandmother was a school teacher over there. And in the summer times, he would come to the coast and live in Westport with his grandparents. And my grandfather was an interesting guy. My dad, one of the stories he talked about, during the Depression, he would raise turkeys. And what they would do is they would let turkeys out on those, they'd let them run free out on those hills up above Westport to chase grasshoppers. And then they'd herd them back in at night. And then they sold turkeys, and they just pretty much just fed them, ranged them on grasshoppers up there.
So Ralph Burns, the sheriff, was your...
No, that's on my mother's side.
Okay.
Yeah. On my dad's side, the Stanleys, it was a Doc Stanley, be my great uncle, and he was the one that caught the Mendocino Outlaws in 1879, I think.
Yeah.
Tom Dollard was killed, and he chased them. Doc Stanley chased those people from the mouth of the 10 Mile River to Nevada, and finally caught them in Nevada.
Doc Stanley was your relative then?
Yeah, he was my great uncle on my dad's
Okay.
side. Anyway, yeah, so my dad, and growing up in Boonville, living with his mom, and everybody knew each other over there, but he really became a he knew Bootling very well, and even after he lost his eyesight, I'd take him to Boonville, and he would get together and they'd harp Boone an awful lot. But my dad, because he was raised by his mom and he knew everybody everybody knew everybody else. This is one of the stories my dad told me. It was pretty funny. And he told me this story, just before he passed away. But I think it was Aaron that asked him one time, what kind of grades did he get in school? And he goes, well, I did okay. And then he goes, well, I used to get A's in some of my classes. And she goes, well, what'd you get an A in? And he goes, well, I got an A in typing. How'd you get an A in typing? So anyway, he tells this story. He goes, as a young boy in Boonville, he was a good athlete, and he played basketball, and the buses didn't take players then. It was up to the kids to get to the games themselves in those days. And so my mother let my dad drive her car. It was a well-known car, a teacher's car there in the valley. So he drove members of the team over, and they played Fort Bragg, and they started working their way back, and they bought some beer, and they were drinking beer going back home. And these are, high school kids, and as they're heading back towards the valley, they're just dropping people off in Navarro and then along there, and pretty soon he's got nobody left in the car, and he's still got one more beer before he gets home. So he figures, well, I might as well just drink this beer before I get home. Yeah. So just as you go into Philo there's the nice little church on the right, the Methodist church. Well, he figured he'd just pull around behind the church there and polish off that beer and then head on home. And it was late, so he whistled around around the church there, and he pulled right up. He said, came right around the corner of the church, and his headlights hit another car, and it was the principal's car. And these two heads popped up, and it was the principal and it was the business teacher's heads. And they looked out and they recognized his mother's car, the teacher's car. And he definitely recognized who they were. So he said he just backed his car around and went on home and, didn't say anything about it. And the end of that semester, he got an A in typing. So he said, what the hell? He goes, I signed up for typing again. He said, I got A's in PE and typing. All the way through school. So he told my daughter, he goes, yeah, I got A's.
Well, total characters that they were. I thought maybe that I would mention too that my father was pretty indignant for, he was, I guess not expelled, suspended from Fort Bragg High School. They did a locker check and they discovered that he had dynamite in his lockers. And so they called him in and threw him out of school for a while. And like he said, what was the big deal? He goes, I hadn't capped it or fused it or anything. He goes, I'm smart enough to know that you don't want to blow the roof off the school over a minor fire. He goes, anyway, we were just going trout fishing after school. So he kept his blasting caps and fuse outside the school, but he did keep the dynamite in his locker so that it would be safe and nobody could get their hands on it. But he and Ed Columby were big partners. The Sunbright Market, Columby's up in Fort Bragg. And my dad always, right up until the end, he would always have to tell the story on Ed Columby. They used to use Alka-Seltzer bottles because it was the perfect size to make a charge of cordite. And they would take an Alka-Seltzer bottle and fill it full of cordite, and they would poke a hole in the cap and put the fuse and the blasting cap in through there, and then they would throw it into a trout hole and blast trout. You can't do that anymore.
That was the old-time way to go fishing.
I know.
That's why
But-
they don't count, probably.
Well, they explained a couple of things. First of all, you should remember to always weigh your charges, because they took 3 pilings out of the 4th trestle, because they didn't weight their charge properly. But they had got a bunch of their cordite wet, and so they were drying it behind the old Sunbright Market, the old Columbia's Market. And it was a very small grocery store at that point, and there were chicken pens and everything in the back, and the chicken coop had a flat roof on it, so they thought that that would be a perfect place to dry their cordite. So they had a pile of it out on the roof there, and they were turning it over with a stick, and they would spread it out on the roof and let it dry, and then they would put it up, and they would keep rubbing it back and forth. And my dad said that he was over there, he was cleaning his rifle because they were up to some mayhem later in the day, and he looked over and Ed had piled all of the powder, all of the cordite up in a pile in the middle there. And he said to my dad, "Yeah, I'm gonna test this powder, Ed." My dad goes, "What?" He goes, "Yeah, I think it's ready." And he reaches in just like this, and he hooks out a little bit of cordite out of the pile, and he drags it over into another little pile right here and strikes a wooden match and puts it down. And he said that, yeah, he goes, it burned really good. It went foof, and then he went foof, foof, foof. And little grains of powder started to burn in a trail back towards the pile. And he said that Ed became more and more frantic with his patting of the pile. And he said, but of course, there was more powder closer to the pile, so it started getting worse, and Ed was right here when the whole pile went up, and it burned all of his eyelashes and his eyebrows off. And didn't really hurt him badly, but it really hurt his ego badly, and my dad, of course, gave him a bad time about it. So it was kind of like a thing that Ed was a little cranky about his whole life. So when I was in high school, it just so happened that I became really good friends with Ed Columbi's son. And we used to hang out together and do things together all the time. So I thought I would tell Ed the story about his dad getting his eyebrows and his eyelashes burned off, because I thought it was pretty funny. But strangely enough, he didn't think it was as funny as I did. And he went home, and his dad said that that wasn't exactly how it happened, and that it might have been partially my father's fault for the whole thing happening. So anyway, we always had kind of a little thing, you know, like our fathers did this thing, you know, and we laughed about it. And so one night, we were in high school, and it was a rainy night out, and in those days they didn't have card lock, and they have no gas stations that you could get gas at. Columbia's was the last place you get at 11 o'clock at night, you know. And back then we thought it was really expensive. It was like 70 cents a gallon or something. And so Ed mentions we want to go for a ride, and Ed mentions that he thinks that his girlfriend's father possibly has gasoline in his garage, and that if we were to slip in there, we could get that gasoline and put it in the car and go for a ride. So I go along with it, and I think that it's an okay idea. And so we go into the garage, and we're looking around, and sure enough, we find 3 milk cans, 3 5-gallon milk cans, and they're underneath the workbench there. And they seem to be pretty full. And so we slide them out where we can see them, but we're trying to do the whole thing kind of quietly and in the dark. And Ed takes the lid off, and he goes, "Smells like gas." And I think, oh, okay, good. And I look over, and he takes a lighter out of his pocket.
Oh, no!
And he takes the lighter, and I'm trying to say no, but it seems like for once I can't say anything. I'm like, and he strikes the lighter, and what I can see is a basketball of fire come out of the can, and it went right up to the ceiling of the garage, and it flattened out there. You know, and I thought, that was amazing. You know, it was like a perfect fireball came out of that can, you know, and it seemed to pass right past Ed's head. And he let out a scream, and he went, "Ah!" And he turned his head this way, and as he did, he passed the lighter back over the top of the can again. And a second fireball came out, and At this point, I was laying on the floor of the garage, really laughing hard. And we went out, we got in the car, and we drive to the bowling alley because Ed's in pain. And we go in, and he races straight into the bathroom and washes his face with cold water and everything. And I run into the bathroom, and I look, and amazingly, all of his eyebrows and his eyelashes were completely burned off. His face was really red, but he wasn't blistered, you know, so I knew he was going to survive and everything. And I always thought that it was the greatest thing because, rest his soul, Phil Apatola was in the bowling alley that night. And when he saw Eddie go by and he smelt the smell of like a singed hog or something as Ed went by, he just took a quarter out of his pocket and he walked over to the jukebox and he dropped it in and he pushed "Light My Fire" 3 times. So history does repeat itself as time goes on.
We used to, one thing my dad did, yeah, it was a really amazing thing. This was a great thing for the entire family. Out on Big River, for years and years, up until the mid-'60s, when Union Lumber Company sold out to Boise Cascade. But from that point back, people from the coast here had camps out on Big River. And you could have a camp out there you get a 99-year lease. And what they charge you, Alvin, like $10 a year or something like
I
that?
think it was $25, $30. Before that, it was free.
Uh-huh.
Joey Pardini, he said he's still paying $50 a year for his lease on the Blair.
We went down to Eaton Grimes in Mendocino, well, where the Ford House is.
Mm-hmm.
He was in charge of all the Mendocino properties at the Union Lumber Company.
Yeah.
Every river had them.
And
Big
it was-
River,
it was
10
free.
Mile.
It was free. You
Yeah.
just,
Yeah. Towards the end of I think it was like the late 50s, early 60s, probably about 10 years, my dad had a camp out there just up from Boyles, or from Lily's, between Lily's and Boyles. And our family would, when school was out, actually Memorial Day weekend, we'd move the refrigerator and move the big stuff out, propane. And then as soon as school was out, everybody would move out to that camp. And they would live there until school started. And my dad and Toby would commute into work every day, take showers at the house, go to work, buy groceries, head back out. And Toby, my stepmom's Aunt Lena,
where was your camp?
just right next to Pop Johnson's, next to May and Pop, just down the river.
May Johnson.
Yeah.
Yeah, just right out by Lily's.
But they would commute in, buy the groceries, do the shopping, and then, but every year, they would live out there,
Yeah.
the kids, and swim. And there were some really wonderful camps out there, and there was just some great tales. It was a wonderful experience for the family. There were always people in and out of there. And that wasn't just our camp, but pretty much from Lily's all the way up to Tulog, there were camps. There was a whole community of people that lived on Big River in the summertime.
We camped at Brooks Camp over the hill, you know.
Yeah. And there was some incredible things that happened out there. But I got a couple of stories here. When I was thinking about camp, when Boise Cascade bought the property, they came through and destroyed camps and kicked everybody out, and the leases were null and void, and everybody got booted in the mid-'60s. But once you were out there, like it was pretty much common knowledge with my dad. If there were some young people around, there would be a job that needed to be done. It's just you were guaranteed something would go on. So we got up there one morning and he decided we need to make a bunch of camp firewood. And there were my brother and I and somebody else, John. So he grabbed a chainsaw and he said, well, we'll go make a couple loads of wood. And it's the last thing we wanted to do. So he grabbed a chainsaw and put gas in it, tried to start it, and it wouldn't start. And we're saying, oh, yes. You know, it was a long ways from that. And my dad, for those people that knew him, didn't have a lot of patience. And he pulled and pulled and pulled and pulled on that starter. And the camp was, maybe 30 feet above the river. And so he was doing this right in the middle of camp. And he finally, out of frustration, one last pull on the chainsaw, and he pulled the chainsaw and at the same time threw it in the river. And that chainsaw no sooner left his hand than it started. we were just watching it slide. we were so happy. He turned around to us, he goes, don't go anywhere. It was like, the dust hadn't settled and he'd come into town and bought a chainsaw. But it was so great to see that saw just go in the water. But there were our camp was just a summer camp. At Alvin's, you had a cabin, so you could go out there in the wintertime.
We had a cabin in later years.
Yeah.
But,
But further up the river, I remember John Lutzie's camp. And Lutzie's,
Lucy was above Pecawati, wasn't it?
not just down a little bit, but he had it.
Down,
Yeah, he had a great cabin, and my dad and friends, of course, John Lucy, they would go out there winter times and steelhead fish.
Yeah.
And it was sort of a crew. I mean, it was John Lucy, he sold, insurance and real estate in town. And then there was Hal Storr, he was the judge.
Yeah.
Tex Beam was the math teacher at the high school. And my dad, and I think Moon Rivers, Harold Rivers, the Falstaff,
yeah.
Those guys would go out there, steelhead fish, and they'd have a heck of a time. They'd open that cabin up and spend weekends out there. And they were out there, all those guys were out there for the weekend fishing. And they caught fish, or for whatever reason, Sunday night, they all had jobs in town. They decided that they were just gonna stay there Sunday night and get up early Monday morning and make it into work. And they were playing cards and having a good time there. And my dad always was the person that, he always woke up the earliest. He never had an alarm clock, and he would wake up and get coffee going, so everybody expected him, and he was designated, okay, Bill, you get up, get things going, wake us up, and we'll get into town and shower, and we'll make her to work in time. Well, my dad woke up at the regular time out there, and there were 2 or 3 guys had watches, and everybody was sleeping. They'd been drinking and playing cards till late that night. So my dad got up, and he went around to each of the guys that had watches and set their watches an hour and a half ahead. And then went back to bed. Anyway, and he jumped out of bed and he goes, "Holy Christ, you guys, I overslept." And he jumped up and they looked at their watches. They flew out of that cabin. They roared into town. I guess they got into town and they noticed the clock in the firehouse, they were an hour and a half ahead of time. My dad was always doing those screwball things like that.
You talked about Harold. Wasn't he a lucky distributor or something?
Falstaff.
Falstaff,
Falstaff.
Okay.
Moon Rivers.
Yeah, his name is Harold. It's funny, he's written down here, Moon plays big, and it's like turning the watches there, a practical kind of joke. My dad and his brothers basically were running Willig Freight Line during the 50s. Vernon was mayor of the town, was a manager of Willig. My dad was a claims manager. John Johansen had the distributorship out of there, and they were all working. Anyway, when they used to go around and deliver, there was a real crew of great guys, Joe Bernardini, and Speedo. He used to long haul for him. They called him Dirty Belly because he always had a black spot on his white t-shirt where the wheel rubbed against from drive that snub-nosed truck. And but Speedo Williams, he lived across the street from my grandparents. And so it was after the war, and there were a lot of newly married couples and stuff. Bill and Toby, my mother and father, Vernon and Marion, and they used to hang out a lot. It was a thing to do. They started partying on Friday afternoon, and they quit on Sunday evening, and it was Saturday and Sunday morning were Silver Fizzes and Ramos Fizzes to get started again. My dad tended bar all the time. He used to tend bar at Shattuck Shanty, especially during the Paul Bunyan days and stuff, which was a real place. In those days, Fort Bragg had more bars, more churches, and more cars than any place in the United States per capita. People are always taken aback by the car thing, but the fact is that in Fort Bragg, everybody had a second car before it was normal so that the guy could go to work. And they were often jalopies. You would see Model A's or old Fords or these old beat-up pickup trucks. You'd look in the bed, you know, and you could see the rear axle right through the bed of the truck. But the guys would drive them to work every day, and they'd be parked in the parking lot down at the mill. So anyway, my dad was delivering for Willie, and he's going down the alley, and he looks in a garbage can, and he sees somebody has thrown away a guitar. And it's just a funky old guitar, an old plastic string guitar. But he spots it in the garbage can, and he can't resist. He takes it out. He takes it home. Knowing him, he probably used fish line to restring the guitar, and he gets it together. But Harold Rivers happens to own a classic Martin guitar that had been in his family for years. It was a beautiful guitar. He could play the guitar, and he used to entertain people at these parties all the time. And one of his signature songs was Moon River.
Moon River.
So they would all get together, and then eventually somebody would say, Moon, play us the guitar, you know, and it happened every single time. And he would always get out the guitar and play a couple of songs for everybody, and they'd have a sing-along, a little karaoke evening. So my dad swings by Moon's place in the early afternoon with the restrung, funky guitar. They take Moon's Martin out of his case, and they slip my dad's new guitar into the case, and they slide it back under the sofa where it lives. And they go, and that's good enough for my dad. It's just there. And so finally, of course, later that evening or the next night, they're all sitting around, they've been drinking, they go back to Harold's place, and eventually somebody in the room does say, Moon, why don't you play the guitar for us? Well, there's a nice fire going in the fireplace, and it's a beautiful evening out, and they're all having a drink. And Harold goes, no, I don't want to play tonight. I play all the time. I don't need to play tonight. And they go, oh, Harold, please play for us, you know. Well, please play the guitar for us. And Harold's like, no, I don't want to play the guitar, you know. And finally, his wife goes, come on, Harold, now play the guitar for them. Pat asks him to do it, and Harold goes, okay. And he reluctantly slides the guitar case out from underneath the sofa and reaches in and takes his guitar out. Well, my dad's sitting right by the fireplace at this point. And he's been kind of quiet, where normally he would have been taking part in this, but he's sitting there. And Harold takes the guitar, and he just gets into the strumming position, and my dad goes, I can't stand it! He goes, if I hear Moon River one more time, I'm going to go out of my freaking mind. And he snatches the guitar out of Harold's hand by the neck and just crushes it into the fireplace. Into the fire. Grabs a poker and pokes the guitar into the fire a little bit like that. Puts the poker back and sits back down and picks up his drink and has a drink. And Harold, of course, is sitting there speechless. And Pat just about died. And even my mother, who was about prepared for anything from my father, was speechless. And of course, Harold and Buck hit the floor laughing, and they rolled, you know, and Harold went in the closet and got his guitar out and stuff, but they thought that that was just the funniest thing. Buck crushed the Martin.
One of my dad's jobs was some of those guys. He was a building inspector. Nobody really knows how he got that job. It's not. It's one of those jobs.
Mystery.
It's who you know. It's not what you know. My dad was not much of a builder, but anyway, he got this job as building inspector, and
Explains a lot about some of the buildings.
I came down one day. I came home for Christmas vacation, and I said, "God darn, Dad, what do you do?" And he goes, "Well, hell, why don't you go for a ride with me? This is the last day we're going to take before Christmas. We'll, you know, just drive around and these sites and see what's going on." And they'd given him an old police car, was his building inspector car.
Right, I remember.
Yeah, so he couldn't open the doors, you know, from the inside. So we get in the car and we drive up to this building site, and we get up and he goes, "Roll down that back window." I go, "What?" He goes, "Roll down that back window." So we roll down the back window and we go in, and he, you know, checks out the building progress, and we go back out. There's a bottle of whiskey in the back seat through that window. So we drive around, he opens up the trunk and puts it in the trunk. We go to another site. But by the end of that, we made, quite a few visitations that day, and every place we stopped. We got done, the whole back end of that car was full of whiskey. They knew exactly what he drank.
I always thought that was funny when my dad wrote a letter from Washington down to Bill and Toby, and he had cut out an article in the newspaper, and inside it said strange rash of burglaries in the suburbs of Everett, Washington. There's somebody been breaking into houses and stealing vodka. And that's what they took out of these houses, and the caption on the bottom of that little article said, "Willie thought you must be in town." He goes, "All that Russian Kool-Aid gone missing."
When they were building inspector, he was the building inspector, and the courthouse gang there was the police chief, Tom John Dahl, and then Hal Storr was the judge, and somebody up at the county yard. Anyway, Friday afternoons they'd rendezvous at my dad's house, and it'd been months and months and months that the faucet in the bathroom had been leaking, and Toby had asked him to repair it, and she started leaving little notes, to fix the leak, and he just kept ignoring it, and so he decided, like that afternoon, somebody went in, they said, "For Christ's sakes, why don't you fix this leak, Bill?" So he goes, "Well, I guess I will." So they were in mixing highballs, so he went underneath the sink to shut it off to change the washer, and the shut-off didn't work. And so he goes, "Well, I guess I'll have to go out to the pump house and shut it off. I'll just shut the water off at the pump." So somebody else went out there with him, and they shut it off out there, and my dad said, this well's always been a shitty well. Never been a good well. And the guy goes, "Well, hell, we can fix it." And there was somebody there from the maintenance yard. So they said, "All you got to do, it's a good well, after a while, you got to open up the veins of the well." So one of them went back to the yard, and they got a big compressor, towed it in, and stuck this compressor down the well, and sealed her all off, and cranked her on. They went in the house and had a few horns. And they came back out and pulled that compressor out of shut her off, pulled it out of the well, and the well just collapsed. There was no well, there was no water. About that time, Toby came home from work. She goes, and his intentions were honorable. He was going to fix the faucet, but from the faucet it went to fix the well.
Destroying the well.
Yeah. But those guys, I bet about 3 days, they had, it was a Koski, it was a well witcher. He came out and witched the well, and they dug that well. They had it pretty much dug by the end of the weekend. They didn't have the ring set. And it's a great well. So it turned out, it worked out really well. But
Yeah, well, necessity is the mother of invention there, so. And so I just wanted to, I said I was going to mention a couple of things about being raised outlaw, and I guess you're getting some of the character of what these guys were like. But when my dad one time said, he goes, "I know this little place," he goes, "I'm going to take you trout fishing." He goes, "And you won't believe that there's even any trout in this stream when you see it." He goes, "But there's some nice trout in there." And so we headed off on an adventure. And we parked he was favorable to DeSoto's. And so he had an old DeSoto. And we drove out there, and we got out and we started walking down this trail. And right across the trail was a barbed wire fence. And I hadn't expected to see that. I mean, I thought, trout fishing place, you would just go there and go trout fishing. But as we walked up, there was a sign on the post next to it. And I was really young, and I was sounding out the sign, and I said, "What does I was trying to get it." He goes, "No trespassing." And I go, "What's that mean?" And he said, It means you can't go there. You're not supposed to go there. And I was kind of crestfallen, you know, I was disappointed because I was really looking forward to going trout fishing. And I was like ready to give up at that point and just take off. But I'll always remember the look on my dad's face, and he put one foot on the second strand of barbed wire and grabbed a hold of the third strand of barbed wire, and he stretched it up and it made a nice little V in the fence. And I'd been through those V's before I knew what that meant, so, and he said to me, "That means everybody but us." And we headed down the trail and we went trout fishing. and we came back and we went back through the fence again. So anyway, years later, Max came along, and I used to do things with him that I had done with my father when I was a kid. So I went to the exact same places. It was something I wanted to do, and I wanted to see what it was like to look through your eyes as your child was doing what I had done with my father in those days. And some of the things, early things that I wanted to do with him was to go get sand dollars. Because my dad, when the ocean had been rough and the conditions were right, which he kept an eye on the ocean all the time, we would go get sand dollars. And I mean, I've come home with a whole shopping bag full of sand dollars from the size of your little fingernail, you know, up to the great big ones. And we would walk 10 Mile Beach, and he would always be muttering that he wanted to find out where those razor clams lived, because he was hot to get those razor clams, but he could never figure out exactly where they were. But we would find their shells all the time. So I did all of these things with Max. So one of the things that I wanted to do was I wanted to go up and park by the Smith Ranch, which is up at the 10 Mile. And if you go up to the 10 Mile where they're building the new bridge now, and you look up on that hillside, there's a barn way up there on the hill. That's Smith Barn. It's been there my entire life. And I had a very memorable moment there. We stopped one morning, and my dad looked up towards that barn from way down by the road, and he said, "Ooh, that's a nice buck." He said, "You see that?" I said, "What?" You know, and I looked out in that field, and all I could see was a barn way up there. And he said, "Standing right there in those ferns," he goes, "right below that barn," he goes, "that's a nice buck." And I looked really hard, and then I looked with the binoculars, and I still couldn't see it standing there. And he just reached inside the truck, the car actually, and he went like that, and he pulled out his .300 Savage, and he jacked one in there, and he took a rest on the post, and he fired a shot, and then he said to me, "Right between the eyes." And I said, "What?" And he said, "Right between the eyes." And we walked all the way up that hill. And we walked right over there, and he walked just like he had a GPS on him. And we walked right there, and I'll always remember, because the deer was down on its knees with its chin on the ground, and its horns were kind of folded over to the side. And he'd shot it right between the eyes from down on the road there with open sights, no scope on the rifle, .300 Savage Model E, open sights. So anyway, I took Max there and I told him that story. But what I wanted to do was do what we used to do, is we'd walk down through the berry patch, go underneath the bridge, walk up into the sand dunes, and then walk back around and cross the highway, and then come back down to the berry patch and get in the car and go, unless we were going into Smith Ranch. So I told Max the whole story about the deer, and we started walking. And he was little. I mean, he was just a little kid. And we went walking down there, and we followed the trail coming around by the truck road there, and sure enough, there was a state fence with a yellow sign on it that said "State property, no trespassing." And you know, it was like, oh, dang. You know, it's like, there it was, you know, it's like, I was just trying to replicate something I had done with my father, you know, but now here the state had slammed up a fence right in front of the whole thing. And I thought, well, I'll just, you know, that means everybody but me. So I just took Max and we went over there and I figured out a place where I was going to cross the fence. And as I got ready to, Max said, we're not supposed to go there. You know, and I figured he'd probably been reading the Richard Scarry, you know, big book of prohibitive signs or something, you know, at daycare or something, because he knew what that sign meant. And I, you know, and I'll always remember, I just kind of like picked him up and put him over the fence. I go, that means everybody but us. And I climbed over the fence, you know, and we walked around and we did the same trail and everything. And so, you know, and it didn't really bother me too much because, hey, it was just a fence and we were just trespassing. So I walked him around and I replicated the walk that I did with my dad. And then not too long after that, we were going down to Healdsburg and I had Max with me, and there is a lilac bush along 128. And it grows where there was an abandoned farmhouse. There used to be a farm there, but it's not anymore. But I would be willing to bet that somebody still owns it. I think it's somebody else's lilac bush. But I've been stopping there for like 20 years, just pruning it, you know, taking care of this lilac bush. I usually do it while it's blooming, because that's the best time to tell, you know, and you cut a certain number of blooms off of the bush at the right time and in the right place, and the bush comes back better next year. And so I just do this to help maintain this lilac bush. So anyway, I thought that that day would be a good day to stop and collect some lilacs. And so I got Max out of the car, and I got I happened to have my clippers with me, and I got out and we started to prune this bush, and I was pruning off some beautiful lilacs. But every time a car would go by, I thought no sense getting other people involved with this. I would drop the lilacs on the ground and, you know, pretend like I was just standing there by the lilac bush. And after I had done this a couple of times, Max, this little innocent kid, looked up at me and he said, "Dad, why are we stealing these lilacs?" And I said, "Why, son, whatever makes you think that I'm stealing these lilacs?" And he said, "Well, every time a car comes," he goes, "you drop those lilacs on the ground," he goes, "and sometimes," he goes, "you even pretend like you're going pee." So I explained to him that all I was doing was I had a contract with these people and that I'd been maintaining their lilacs for years. And that through proper maintenance, that's why there were a lot of lilacs. And so I picked up my lilacs and I thought, you know, you really have to teach your children well. And you know, you don't want to raise them up to be outlaws unless you want to turn out like me. You know, so it is funny, you know, there are definite lessons to be learned and things like that. So, and that poor lilac has gone to heck since I quit taking care of it.
Talking about Boonville in that area, I'll tell you this story. It's somewhat related to my dad, but it's an interesting snapshot of Mendocino history. It occurred in 1943, January of 1943. There was World War II, of course, was going on, and there was a big airplane that was supposed to fly from Hawaii to San Francisco in January. I think it was January 21st or something like that. And this plane was a huge plane. They were called Pan Am Clipper ships, and they were so big that they landed on water. They had at least, I think, 120-foot wingspan.
They were huge, yeah, it was a big plane.
Big 4-engine plane, and they were really state-of-the-art plane before the war. And they were passenger planes, and they were planes because they crossed water, and there was more water to land on than there were airports. They were designed, of course, only to land on water. And when World War II broke out, this particular clipper ship, the Panama Clipper, was taken over by the Navy, but they retained the crew and the pilot. And it was a rear admiral in Hawaii, and he was in charge of the Pacific Fleet of submarines for the United States. And he had the positions of all those submarines, and they were in some sort of a microfilm container, and they needed to be to the mainland. And so they were to take this clipper ship to San Francisco, land near Sausalito. But there was a storm coming in, and the pilot knew of the storm coming in and discouraged the admiral from flying, from leaving Hawaii. But the admiral overrode him and said, "No, we're going." So there were 19 people on that big clipper ship, and they took off from Hawaii. And sure enough, as soon as they took off, the wind caught them, and they got to San Francisco way ahead of time with this tailwind. And they actually arrived in San Francisco when it was still dark. And the plane, and the wind was blowing, the bay was chopping. So they couldn't land the plane until it was light. So this big clipper ship started making circles. They were within radio contact with the plane. It got light, and the plane disappeared. And they had absolutely no idea where it just vanished with this rear admiral and all this information on it, with 18 other people. And they thought, well, maybe it'd flown on down to San Diego, and it hadn't. And by this time, the storm was just raging. It was one of the major storms to hit California. And that plane disappeared for 10 days. Nobody knew where it was. And at the end of they were searching everywhere for the plane. And even in the Anderson Valley, Boonville area, they were searching. My dad was 16 years old at the time, and his good friend Jack June, a fellow from Boonville, they were on horseback, and they were searching. And just as it was getting dark, a small plane came over the top of them and started signaling to them. And they weren't sure what it meant. And they returned, and then they later learned that the small plane had spotted a wreck, and my dad and Jack June were in direct line heading towards the wreck. So the next day, they went out and picked up where they were before, and sure enough, they went right into the wreck. And here was this humongous big clipper ship that had flown and had gone into a box canyon and hit a rock wall and caught on fire. And there was no access in there except for horseback. So my dad and Jack came out. The military was alerted, and they took bulldozers and they worked a road in part way, but they still couldn't get all the way into the crash site. And so my dad, they removing the bodies. I have some awful photographs of my dad loading the bodies on horses and taking them up to a Jeep and then on up to the road to where they could get it out. But it just brought in this massive amounts of FBI and high government officials looking for that microfilm of the submarines. And they couldn't find it. And they searched and searched and searched, and it was never discovered. So they went in and they dynamited the area. They figured if they couldn't find it, nobody could find it. So they dynamited the area and then reburnt the area. And it was really everybody knew about it, and it became quite a big news article in the country. And so when spring came around, a school teacher from Anderson Valley, for a field trip towards the last of school, they were fourth graders, 10-year-olds, they took them in and they hiked in to the crash site, took their lunch in. You could still find chunks of metal and different pieces. And as this class of 10-year-olds were climbing around and fiddling around down in there, one of the boys climbed an oak tree, and he got up about 10 feet in the oak tree. He found this canister. And he took the canister back to Boonville and showed it to his parents, and his parents showed it to Jack's father, the judge. And they said the next morning there were never has been as many black cars in Boonville. And and this was several months later that the 10-year-old boy found the film, the position of the submarines. Amazing little bit of Mendocino County history. My dad lost.
Gayla Barron wrote that up. You know, she's the columnist for the Press Democrat.
Oh, did she?
In fact, I even have that on my computer at home.
Uh-huh.
And she wrote up about this it was a seaplane, it was a Philippine. the name
Exactly, Philippine Clipper, yeah.
That crashed at Bell Valley, because my son Mitch and his wife lived at Bell Valley.
Uh-huh,
Not them,
yeah.
but it was quite, it's quite the article.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's something I didn't know anything about, and then, I think it was well, my dad lost his eyesight the last 12 years of his life. He was paralyzed, and he completely lost his sight. And he and Jack Jr. were the only two living people that had actually been into that site when it was right after the plane crashed. And they wanted to place a monument on the top of that mountain, commemorating the site. And the Admiral's son was there. And anyway, make long story short, my brother Russell and I took my dad over, and then we had to take him in by Jeep, and then we ended up having to pack him up to that site because they wanted him there. And then they did a video of Jack and my dad talking about being the first ones into that crash site. But it's one of those things I knew nothing about until it was quite a significant bit of county history.
It's an interesting thing that I noticed that only came out, that article came out 4 or 5 years ago, I think.
Yeah. My dad, after he lost his eyesight, it's really tragic. He was a very strong, did a lot of fishing, hunting. He was a very physical fellow, and for the last 12 years of his life, he was pretty much confined. He could get around on a walker sort of, and then completely blind. So he spent a lot of time thinking, and he spent a lot of time on the phone, talking, reconnecting, and I would take him to Boonville to revisit his old friends over there, and my friends would come and visit him. And he would just, he was one of those people, he'd get something in his mind, and it would just stay with him, you know, and then he'd grab his phone, and he'd call somebody, and he'd call somebody else, and so he had this really great phone network, and it really sort of kept him alive.
Well, it was one Easter or somewhere in the spring that you would always plant a row of potatoes for your father.
His birthday, May 1st, yeah.
I always thought that was great.
Yeah. But one of the phone calls my dad made, and I think it'll be all right to tell this story here, as he was thinking, you know, he'd get something in his mind, and he would just drop back, and he'd be right there. And later on in his life, he will, like your dad, if they got something in their head, they would just do it. You know, they wouldn't think about it, or they wouldn't plan it out or write it. They just, well, let's do it. So he started reminiscing as a young boy. He said he was in junior high school, and he said he was in the band, and there was this girl that was older than he was by several years, who was a cheerleader. And he said she was the most beautiful woman, most beautiful girl he'd ever seen in his life. And he wondered whatever happened to her. So he started calling his friends in Boonville, and nobody knew. And finally somebody said, oh, she married this guy, and I think they moved to San Mateo. And so he got a hold of their information, and he called San Mateo and got a hold of this woman, and sure enough, it was a woman, you know, and he hadn't seen her, you know, since those days. And so he said he introduced himself, and she couldn't remember, you know, who he was, and they got to talking, and she, you know, they had friends in common, and she hadn't been back to Boonville, you know, years and years and years, and she was quite a bit older than my dad. And my dad told her, and it's funny, I would go over and have a highball or a glass of wine with my dad after school, and we'd visit the day, and so I just happened to come across the field, and he said, God, let me tell you this woman I just talked to. So he started telling me this story, and this was just before he passed away. And so I was, you know, sitting there talking, I had no idea where it was going, and he goes, I played the bass drum when I was in junior high school, and he goes, God, we'd have to play for those football games. He goes, we'd have to wear wool uniforms, it'd be 100 degrees outside, have to sit there in the stands, I just beat on this bass drum. And he said, the only thing that kept my sanity, he goes, was this girl. He goes, she was the most beautiful girl I've ever seen in my life. He goes, and so he said, I just decided, he told me how he tracked her down, he finally got a hold of her, and he said he talked about her, they talked back and forth about this and that, about the valley, and went on and on. He said he talked to her for about 20 minutes, and he said, you know, I really have to tell you why I called you. And she goes, well, why is that, Billy? And he goes, well, Martha, of all the time I've lived and all the time I've been able to see, you had the most beautiful body of anybody I've ever seen, ever, period. And he said there was just silence on the other phone. He said he just expected click. He said after about 20 seconds of dead air, she came back on, she said, "Why, Billy, that's about the nicest thing anybody said to me in the last 30 years. He said they talked for another hour.
Bill, what happened to his eyesight?
What's that?
What happened to his eyesight? How did
He had a blockage in an artery going up that feeds his eyes, and so he had to go to San Francisco to have an operation to get that cleared out. And so when he had the operation to get that cleared out, he had a stroke as they were operating on him. And as a result of the stroke, like I was there when Toby and I were there when he came out of the operating room, we were talking to him, and and his eyesight was getting bad because he wasn't getting a lot of blood to his eyes before the operation. And I remember there was a clock at the foot of his bed, and he said, "God, I think I can see better. Things are brighter now than they were before." And he had these, and then his eyesight just disappeared as a result of the stroke. And then his left side of his body became paralyzed.
Oh, then he was paralyzed.
Yeah. So he was that way 12 years, and he would spend a lot of time towards the end sleeping, because he said when he slept he dreamt, and when he dreamt he could see and he could walk and do everything in his dream.
What age was he, do you know?
He was young. Oh, you mean when he passed away?
When he passed away.
66.
How old?
66. So yeah, it was it was incredibly sad, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. But he always, you never really knew where he was coming from. He'd always, something would come up, come out of the blue. When I think about my dad, as I said, like from the time I was like 20 years of age on, we did a lot of jobs together. We worked together. He was always a knack at not only finding jobs for himself, but finding me jobs, whether I wanted them or not. I remember one time I came home from school and he goes, "Well, I got a good job for you." And I go, "What's that?" He goes, "You're going to work the police department." I go, "No, I'm not going to do that, Dad. No, I'm not going to be a cop." But anyway, he'd come up with the craziest jobs.
Got you the uniform already.
Yeah, but one of the greatest things my dad did was his father died when he was only 10 in Boonville, and so he never really knew a lot about his dad. And then my mother and father divorced, at an early age. And then years later, my mother came across a box of letters that belonged to his dad, and they got back to my dad in the mid-1960s, and he read through those letters, and they were letters from Ireland to his father here on the coast. And so he sat down and just wrote a letter to Kilcaroon, County Tipperary, Ireland, to somebody Brazill, and said who he was and wanted to know if anybody was still alive. And God, this letter came back almost instantly from Ireland to him, because they had no idea that there was anybody still living over here, part of the family. And then our family never had a lot of money, hardly had any money, but somehow he rustled up enough money together for a plane ticket to go to Ireland. And I don't think he'd ever been out of California except to be married in Reno in his life. But he flew to Ireland and spent 3 weeks in Ireland and came back a changed person, just having that sense of his family. He knew about the Stanleys, but not about the Brazils. And then, so he reestablished that connection, and then a couple of years later, 2 girls came out and spent the summer with him, Kitty and Ann, and then they went back, and then another summer, a young boy, Walter, came out and spent the summer with him. And then my dad and Toby went back to Ireland, and my niece, Katie, went back to Ireland and lived with a cousin and attended school that were teachers back there. And we've been back several times, and other relatives have come out. So if he hadn't written that letter, that whole family connection would be lost. And it's such a such an important part for us and such an important part for our relatives in Ireland that we have that connection again. It was just an absolutely wonderful thing he did. Do you have that story about that sandwich? Are people getting tired? You know that Willig sandwich?
Well, that's the Willig sandwich is Willig Freight Line. It was kind of like a fraternity for a while when the Johansens were running it. They had good jobs there. My dad was good friends with B.J. Willig, the owner of the company. He provided him with abalone and mussel and venison and stuff like that. So they used to have free reign. I can actually tell two great stories. One of them is my dad was a practical joker, so they used to deliver all of the coffins in Fort Bragg. So anytime he knew that somebody was going to be on the dock to get something and they had a coffin on board, of course he would have to hop into it and pop out at the appropriate time. With a little help from somebody else. It's like, oh my God, is that a coffin? Oh yes, so-and-so just died. We're shipping them back to San Francisco. What? I didn't know that you should. Oh yes, we always ship them. And then my dad would open up and say hi to everybody. Send them terrifying off the dock. But there was a person who worked there who was notorious for going in your lunch and sampling your lunch. He was hungry all the time. As a matter of fact, they had an unflattering name for him. They called him Kenny the Pig. And so he would eat all the time. My dad claimed he had a tapeworm. And he would go in, though. My dad was a really good cook, and anything that he made was good. Even a sandwich. He made great sandwiches. And he was well known for his meatloaf. And actually, Bill's stepbrother, John, always talks about, he goes, never forget the first time your dad made meatloaf. He goes, it came out of the oven, he goes, shaped like a perfect pig. He goes, it looked just like a pig. He goes, with bacon strips and everything on it. So he would mold his meatloaf and everything. So he made these meatloaf sandwiches, and Kenny would slip in there and get a meatloaf sandwich if he knew my dad had one. So my dad, one time, came to work and he had a meatloaf sandwich, but the other two sandwiches in his lunch were Skippy dog food. And he had opened a can of Skippy or Alpo and sliced it up and made a couple of these sandwiches. And Kenny nailed those sandwiches out of his lunch bag and had them. And of course my dad was just loving it. And they were in the office having coffee, and Kenny walked in and he goes, Bill, I just have to tell you, he goes, I took that sandwich, he goes, that's the best damn meatloaf sandwich. And my dad just looked up and said, Kenny, I'll bring you another one tomorrow. And he did. So until the can of Alpo was gone, Kenny had a meatloaf sandwich every day. But every year, this is a really, has to do with Willig and my dad and all those guys. Every year at Paul Bunyan, during Paul Bunyan days, the Union Lumber Company would put out a gigantic load of logs. They'd bring an off-highway truck right through the middle of town. They would put a 3-log or a 5-log load on it, and they would have guys on top of it. I've seen them stretching the wires.
Raising power lines.
Raising the power lines to get the truck underneath. They'd have 45,000, 50,000 feet of timber on the truck. And even though it was politically incorrect, this was the time when the Aborigine Lumber Company had the mill. And I mean, does anybody know what the Aborigine logo looked like on the side of their trucks?
Yeah.
Do you remember, Bill?
Yeah.
I mean,
skull and bone.
well, it was a Hottentot, a caricature of a Hottentot with a bone through their nose and a big cannibal pot. And they literally owned a giant cannibal pot, and they used to put it on a truck with a fake fire, and they would have somebody in the pot, and they would be cooking them during the parade. the deputies would be running up and down the street with real firearms on, arresting people if they didn't have a smooth puss badge on. Now, if you didn't have a beard and you didn't have a smooth puss badge, I have seen wives screaming and crying and begging for the deputies not to arrest their husband. And they would be dragging some poor Flatlander off, hurl him onto a truck that had a cage on the back of it, and just haul him up the street to the kangaroo court, where they would then try him and fine him if they wanted to. They might not let him out of jail, though. They'd keep him in there. And this whole deal. So one of the themes that they were going to do this year, that in the distributorship warehouse in the back, they had a bar, a complete bar, that had been come out of a bar in Fort Bragg. And so they took the Burgomeister, because they had the Burgomeister distributorship there, and they had a great truck, the Bergie Steakside truck, and it was it looks like a van, but the sides are open, and they have 2x4 stakes go in the side of it, so it's basically an open flatbed with a roof and everything on it. So they took all the stakes out, they took the bar, put it in the truck, stocked the bar completely with alcohol, got some bar stools and put them in there, had a bartender, they had a piano, and they had a complete bar scene set up in the Burgomeister truck. They then head out and they head down Main Street with this thing. Now, it's taken a couple hours for the parade to get together. The logging trucks are going by, and now comes the Burgomeister truck with the bar built in the back, and they've been pouring real cocktails the whole time they're getting ready to go. My dad's driving the truck. They drive up, they turn off of Main Street onto Oak Street, right at the Piedmont at that point, which was a big gang. All of the bar stools at the bar tip over. All of the guys who are drinking at the bar fall out of the side of the truck. They all land in the street. They get banged up. I mean, they're scraped up. They're all wearing white shirts and stuff, but by now they're bleeding, some of them. Everybody gets up, dust themselves off. They get back in the truck. They stand the stools back up. The piano player gets back up, gets back on his stool, gets back at the piano. The truck just stops there, and the bartender makes new cocktails for everybody. Once everybody has a new drink, they all get at the thing, the piano starts playing, and they drive 1 block from Main Street to Franklin Street, which is now there at the corner. The Coast is here, and the Diamond Inn is across the street, Dick's. They go around that corner. All of the bar stools fall over. All of the guys fall into the street. The piano player falls off of his bench. All of the drinks are spilled. They get everybody up, they dust themselves off, they get back in the truck, and they repeat this through Fort Bragg until by the time they get to the far end, nobody has a clean shirt. They're all covered with blood. Their sleeves are torn out of their shirts. They've broken 4 sets of glasses, and the bar stools have fallen out of the truck 4 times. They didn't use that one the next year. But that's what it was like in those days. And nowadays things, I can remember going up to the high pole climbing contest, and I don't know, there was a guy who came every year. He was famous. But the first time that I saw him, it freaked me out so bad that I didn't ever want to go again. And they used to have 3 poles, 2 short ones and a tall one. And this guy would come out to climb the pole, and he would be completely drunk. And he'd just be stumbling. And he would get to this pole, and he would climb. And he would get up about halfway, and he'd fall a couple of steps, and then he would climb up, and he'd finally get up to the top of the pole, and he'd hang over the top of the pole, just like he barely made it. You couldn't believe it. He'd get up, and then everybody go, "Oh no!" And he would start to climb up on top of the pole. And then finally, when he got up there, he would have no rope on or anything, and he would be teetering around on the top of this pole, and then pretty soon he would start to fall off. And then he would catch himself, and he would fall off, like he was going to fall forward. And this went on for a big time, and he'd finally be standing on one leg and kind of rocking back, going like this with his arms And then at the last second, he would reach into his pocket and he'd take out a deck of cards. And he'd quickly go. And he could throw a whole deck of cards out around the pole and they'd all come floating down like that. And then he would jump off of the pole. He would drop off the pole, throw the rope out like this, and the pole would drop over the top and he'd hit about 3 times coming down. Hit the bottom and he'd get off. A big cheer would go up and everything there. The old man would reach down and grab it and go, "Had you scared there for a minute, I was on." And they'd lead you off. But those were the wild days. I mean, when Paul Bunyan Day started, there was gunfire and drinking and wild debauchery in Fort Bragg for, 3 days. And Shattuck Shanty was the center of it. And I can remember going in and standing behind the bar at Shattuck Shanty during the attendant bar with my dad. Those were the days.
Shattuck's was on Franklin, wasn't it?
Corner of Franklin and Laurel.
Yeah.
Had swinging doors on both streets. The doors never closed at Shattuck Shanty.
I was in there a couple of times.
I'll bet. The Cousin Inn, Dick's Diamond Inn, Lungo's. Yeah. The Carved Bull, the whole deal.
And also in Paul Bunyan, there used to be slot machines in Fort Bragg.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Anything went.
Yeah, the bootlegging and outlawing and everything, that was, that's what
You
it
could
was.
see over the bar, I understand, I've been told that they would serve you.
Really?
I heard that.
Yeah. I had heard that too.
The other thing that was pretty amazing, like almost a lot of the bars, well, like Dick's Place here in Mendocino, a lot of the hotels, there was a bar, but there was also a nice big dining room. And they had family-style dinners, and everybody, there were long tables, and families would go in, and it would be people, kids, and women mostly. The men would be in a bar, but when the food started serving, then all the men would rumble out, and food would just keep going around and around the table. Like Coast Hotel had it, the Italia Hotel, Cousin Inn, Pete.
We used to go to the Italia Hotel
Yeah.
all the time, and you
Dick's had it.
take your own pot,
Yeah.
and you take your own, and you get ravioli, or alphabet soup, or minestrone soup, and everything like that. And food was a big part. Club Fort Bragg was open 24 hours, liquor store, restaurant, bar, and that was a big hub of the town there. People after hours, they partied and ate in all of these places. The Milano was a residential hotel, as was the Coast. And
Did we wrap this up, do you think?
Well-
My back's getting sore. I don't know if-
Well, it hasn't been a marvelous afternoon.
Yeah.